The car seat was installed in the back of my Mercedes GLC. I'm Arya. I was 24 years old, standing in my parents' garage on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and I was looking at a navy blue infant car seat strapped into the back seat of a vehicle that had my name on the title. A sippy cup sat in the cup holder. A crinkled board book, something about farm animals, had slipped between the seat and the door. Someone's cheerful yellow rain boot was wedged under the passenger seat. I stood there for a long moment. The garage smelled like motor oil and old cardboard, the way it always had. The fluorescent light above me buzzed faintly. My hands were in my jacket pockets, and I remember thinking, very calmly, that I must be misunderstanding something. That there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. That I would walk inside, ask my mother, and we would laugh about it. I was 24 years old, and I had spent most of my life believing that staying quiet was the same as being patient. That not making waves was a form of strength. It took me an embarrassingly long time to understand that it wasn't strength at all. It was just a very polished, very practiced form of disappearing. My name is Arya Reynolds. I was a freelance content writer, the kind of job that sounds creative when you explain it at family dinners and then gets immediately dismissed when your older sister announces she's been promoted at her marketing firm. I worked from a second-hand desk in a small apartment 20 minutes from my parents' house, took on clients I found through LinkedIn and a couple of content platforms, and made enough to cover rent, groceries, and not much else. I didn't own a lot. I had my laptop, my books, a decent coffee maker, and, until recently, a white Mercedes GLC that my grandmother had bought for me 3 months earlier for my birthday. The Mercedes had been Grandma Eleanor's idea entirely. She'd called me in July, 2 weeks before my birthday, and told me she wanted to do something meaningful. Not a check, she'd said, her voice carrying that particular mix of warmth and firmness that I'd always found steadying. Something you'll actually use. She knew I'd been borrowing my friend's car for client meetings, that I'd been turning down work because I couldn't reliably get places. She handled everything, the dealership, the paperwork, the insurance for the first year. She showed up at my apartment on my birthday with the keys and a card that said, in her slightly old-fashioned handwriting, for the girl who never asks for anything. I cried in the parking lot. I wasn't someone who cried easily, but that day I did. 3 months later, the car was in my parents' garage with my nephew Ethan's things inside it. I stood there a beat too long before I went inside. My mother was in the kitchen when I came through the back door. Linda Reynolds, my mother, was the kind of woman who was always in motion, always arranging something, always making sure that whatever room she was in looked curated and intentional. She had the phone pressed between her ear and shoulder, one hand stirring something on the stove, the other reaching for a dish towel. She glanced at me when I walked in, gave me the tight-lipped smile she used when she was on a call she considered important, and turned slightly away. I sat down at the kitchen island and waited. The house smelled like garlic and rosemary. Through the window above the sink, the backyard looked gray and flat under October clouds. I could hear my father somewhere upstairs, a drawer opening, the low murmur of a sports broadcast. Everything was exactly as it always was. Ordinary. Calm. Slightly too quiet in the way that houses get when people inside them have decided not to say certain things out loud. My mother finished her call and set the phone on the counter. "You're earlier than I expected," she said. Not hello, not how are you. Just the mild observation that I'd arrived ahead of whatever internal schedule she kept. "I came to get the car," I said. She turned back to the stove. Madison needed it this week. She had Ethan's pediatric appointment and Derek's car is in the shop. There it was. Delivered in the same tone she used to explain why we were having chicken instead of salmon for dinner. Mild, final. Requiring no further discussion. I sat with it for a second. This week. As if the car had been lent for a week. As if this was the first time. "Mom," I said carefully. "That's my car." "I know it's your car, Arya." She said my name the way she always did when she thought I was being unnecessarily complicated about something simple. "Madison needed it. She's your sister. You work from home." And there it was, the geometry of our family, laid out in 2 sentences. Madison needed something. I worked from home. The conclusion was self-evident. I did not say what I was thinking. I didn't ask how long this week had actually been, or when exactly Madison had taken the car, or whether anyone had planned to mention it to me. I looked at my mother's back and I felt something tighten in my chest, not quite anger, not yet. Something quieter. Something that had been quietly accumulating for years and hadn't yet found the shape of a word. When will she bring it back? I asked instead. My mother stirred the pot once, twice. We'll figure it out, she said. We'll figure it out. I drove home in a rideshare that night, staring out the window at the darkening street, and I told myself it was temporary. That was the first mistake. Not the last. The thing about growing up as the younger daughter in a family like mine is that you learn very early to read the room. Not loudly. Not obviously. You learn to notice the tiny recalibrations, the way a conversation shifts when Madison walks in, the way my mother's voice changes register, lifts slightly, becomes more animated. You learn to notice when you've said something and nobody responded, and how to fold that silence back inside yourself without letting it show on your face. I was the younger one by 5 years. Madison was 29, married to Derek Clark, mother to 3-year-old Ethan, living in a nice house 20 minutes in the opposite direction from our parents. She had a career she was proud of, a husband who brought flowers on non-occasions, a son who called her mommy in a way that made the whole room soften. Madison was, in every visible sense, what success looked like in our family's vocabulary. I was the one who was still figuring it out. I don't say this bitterly. I said it to myself as a plain fact for most of my 20s, the way you accept that you're not naturally good at parallel parking or that you'll always run slightly cold. It was just the arrangement of things. Madison was the one who had figured things out. I was the one who was still trying. What I didn't examine closely enough, not then, anyway, was what that arrangement had cost me. How much I had quietly stepped aside, made myself smaller, adjusted my needs to fit whatever space was left after Madison's were accounted for. In the weeks after I found the car seat in the Mercedes, I told myself a number of things that weren't quite true. I told myself that Madison genuinely needed the car and that it made logical sense. She had a child. Derek's car was in the shop. I worked from home 3 days out of 5, took client calls over video, and could manage without the GLC for a few days. I even told myself, briefly, that it was the generous thing to do, to be flexible, to not be the kind of person who made a family crisis out of a borrowed vehicle. But the days stretched. Then they became a week. Then another. I texted Madison directly the second week. Casual, light, the kind of message I'd carefully calibrated to not sound accusatory. Hey, just wanted to check in about the car. When do you think you'll be done with it? She responded 4 hours later. So sorry. Things have been crazy. Probably another week? Derek's situation is taking longer than expected. You're the best, seriously. I stared at that text for a while. You're the best, seriously. Gratitude used as a period, as a full stop, as a way to close a subject without actually closing anything. Another week passed. I called my mother. She still needs it, my mother said. Ethan has another appointment. And Madison said the commute is really hard without a reliable car. Her commute, I repeated. To work. Yes, Arya. She works. The implication hung there, delicate and precise. She works. As if I did not. As if what I did, the hours at my desk, the clients, the deadlines, the quietly building freelance career that was actually starting to go somewhere, was somehow less legitimate because it happened inside my apartment. I remember sitting at my desk after that call, my coffee going cold beside me, staring at the cursor blinking on an unfinished article. Something had shifted inside me, but I couldn't name it clearly yet. It felt less like anger and more like the beginning of a question I wasn't sure I wanted to ask. I started keeping track. Not in any formal way, I wasn't writing anything down yet, but internally. The number of times I asked and was told soon. The number of times I mentioned the car in conversation and watched my mother redirect the subject. The number of times Madison sent a voice note that was warm and affectionate and said absolutely nothing about giving the car back. I also started noticing other things. At Sunday dinner the following week, I arrived to find Madison already there with Ethan and Derek and a warmth in the room that was slightly louder than usual. My mother had made Madison's favorite, the lamb dish with apricots, and there were flowers on the table, which my mother only did for what she considered special occasions. I'd forgotten that it was the anniversary of Madison and Derek's first date. My mother had not. I sat down and served myself and smiled at the right moments and told Ethan he was very impressive for knowing all the dinosaur names, and nobody mentioned the car. After dinner, while my mother and Madison were in the kitchen together washing up, I could hear them through the open doorway. Not words exactly, just the register of the conversation. Easy. Warm. The natural shorthand of two people who talked every day and knew each other's rhythms completely. I sat in the living room with my father and my Uncle Robert, who was visiting, and I thought about how rarely my mother called me first. How I was almost always the one to initiate. I filed that thought away. Looking back now, that dinner was the first real turning point, not because anything dramatic happened, but because it was the night I stopped pretending the pattern didn't exist. I had spent years calling it different things. Mom just connects more easily with Madison. They have more in common. It's not about me. But sitting in that living room, listening to the sound of a warmth I was not included in, something quietly settled into clarity. The question wasn't whether I was being treated differently. The question was how long I had been accepting it as normal. My blind spot, and I see it clearly now, was that I had confused accommodation with virtue. I thought that not demanding things made me easygoing. I thought that adjusting to everyone else's needs made me generous. But there's a difference between generosity and erasure, and I had never learned to tell them apart. I kept giving space because I thought it was kind. I didn't understand that the space I was giving was the space where I was supposed to exist. The car continued to be unavailable. October turned into November. I started scheduling client meetings around public transit and the occasional rideshare, quietly rerouting my life around a gap that was never supposed to be there. The Sunday before Grandma Eleanor's birthday, I finally asked directly. Not by text. I drove to my parents' house and sat down across from my mother and said, plainly, Mom, I need the car back. I have 3 client meetings next week that I can't do remotely. My mother set down her tea. She looked at me the way she looked at problems she had already decided the shape of. Arya, she said. Madison is your sister. She has a child. You don't. That's not. You can take ride shares. You're young, it's not a hardship. It's my car. It's a car, she corrected gently. Madison needs it more right now. You'll understand when you have children of your own. I understood nothing of the sort. But I looked at my mother's face, that closed, patient expression that meant the decision had already been made, and what I was doing now was just the administrative process of catching up to it, and I said nothing more. I went home and I called Grandma Eleanor. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, there was a short silence. Come to my birthday party, she said. Next Saturday. The whole family will be there. I know, I said. I'll be there. Good. Another pause. Arya, I want you to know that I'm aware of exactly what's happening. Something in my chest went very still. What do you mean? I mean I know, she said. Quietly. Firmly. In the voice she used when she was not opening a discussion but closing one. Come Saturday. I didn't sleep well that week. There are moments that don't announce themselves as important. They arrive dressed as ordinary conversation, as an offhand comment, as a look that passes across someone's face and disappears before you can be sure you saw it. The week before Grandma Eleanor's party, I started paying attention differently. I had coffee with my Aunt Patricia on Wednesday, my mother's sister-in-law, married to my Uncle Robert, a woman I'd always liked for her directness and her total indifference to family politics. We met at a cafe near her office, and she ordered a flat white and asked me how I was doing with the expression of someone who already knew the answer was not great. How long has Madison had the car, she asked. About 6 weeks, I said. Patricia wrapped both hands around her cup. She didn't say anything immediately, which was unusual for her. Patricia was not someone who sat with her thoughts for very long. The fact that she paused told me something. Has your mother said anything to you about the arrangement being permanent? She asked. The word permanent landed oddly. No, I said. She keeps saying Madison needs it right now. Like it's temporary. Patricia nodded slowly. And has Madison said anything? She thanked me. A lot. For being understanding. Another pause. Patricia looked down at her cup. Have you talked to Eleanor? She told me to come to the party Saturday. Patricia looked up at that, and something crossed her face, brief, controlled, but unmistakably significant. Not surprise. Recognition. As if a piece had just clicked into a shape she'd been watching form. Good, she said simply. Then she changed the subject. I didn't push. But I walked out of that coffee with the distinct, unsettled feeling that I was the only person in my family who didn't fully understand what was happening. That everyone else was standing slightly ahead of me, looking at something I couldn't see yet, waiting for me to catch up. At work, I was distracted. I missed a deadline for the first time in 2 years, not by much, just a few hours, but enough that my client sent a follow-up email with a slightly cooler tone than usual. I apologized and delivered and told myself to focus. But focus required a kind of internal quiet I wasn't currently able to locate. On Thursday, I drove past Madison's house. I wasn't going that way intentionally, or maybe I was, I'm still not sure, and my Mercedes GLC was parked in Madison's driveway. Not in the garage. In the driveway, in full daylight, with a pink parking permit hanging from the rearview mirror. A parking permit registered to Madison and Derek's Neighborhood Association. My car had a parking permit for my sister's neighborhood. I sat at the corner for a moment and looked at it. White Mercedes GLC. My license plate. My grandmother's gift. Registered to my sister's street. Something went very cold in my chest. Not hot cold. The kind of cold that precedes absolute clarity. I had been telling myself that my mother was managing a temporary inconvenience. That Madison genuinely needed a short-term solution and that the situation was in the process of resolving itself. But you don't get a neighborhood parking permit for a car you're borrowing for another week. You get one when you've decided the car is staying. I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. I drove home and I sat at my desk and I pulled up the email chain from the dealership just to look at it, just to remind myself of what was real. Grandma Eleanor's name on the purchase documents. My name as primary driver. The insurance paperwork in my name. My name. I thought about what Patricia had said. Not the words exactly, she'd been careful not to say much directly. It was the pauses. The way she'd looked when I mentioned the party. The way she'd said good when I told her Eleanor had asked me to come. Something was happening that I didn't have all the pieces of yet. I also, for the first time, let myself wonder about Madison. Not with hostility, Madison, and I had never been close in the way that some sisters are, but we weren't enemies either. We existed in parallel, shaped by the same parents into very different versions of acceptable. But had she known the arrangement was becoming permanent? Had she asked for that, or had my mother simply decided it and told her it was fine? I wasn't sure which answer was more troubling. The Friday before the party, I got a text from my mother. It read, "Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. Mom asked that everyone be there by noon. Also, just so you know, I mentioned to a few of the aunts that you generously offered your car to Madison while Derek's situation sorted out. People have been very impressed by your thoughtfulness." I read it twice. You generously offered. My mother had told the extended family that I had given the car away willingly. That this was my choice. My generosity. She had constructed a narrative, clean, flattering to me on the surface, and completely false, and she had distributed it before I could say anything different. I set the phone face down on my desk. I understood then, with a quietness that felt almost like calm, that this was not a misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand. This was a decision that had been made, dressed up, and presented to the world before I had the chance to object. My mother had not borrowed my car and forgotten to return it. She had transferred ownership through the simple act of social reality. If enough people believed I had given it away, then the question of whether I'd actually consented became irrelevant. That was the moment I should have made some calls. Should have documented everything, prepared myself. Instead, I sat there too long, turning the phone over in my hands, feeling something between fury and a strange disoriented grief. Not just for the car. For the version of my family I'd been insisting on believing in. That detail, you generously offered, is the one that stayed with me longest. Because it wasn't cruel. It didn't attack me. It repurposed me. It turned my silence, my accommodation, my careful non-confrontation into a prop in someone else's story. All those years of staying quiet and not making waves had apparently trained my mother to believe that my absence of objection was the same as consent. Maybe she wasn't entirely wrong to think that. That was the hardest part. Saturday arrived with weak November sunlight and the particular nervous energy I associated with large family gatherings, the kind where everyone is performing a version of themselves that requires just enough effort to be faintly exhausting. Grandma Eleanor's 70th birthday party was held at her house, a wide craftsman-style home that smelled like cedar and old books and something baked with cinnamon. She'd lived there since before my mother was born. The house had a big dining room and a sitting room that opened onto a covered porch, and by noon it was full of family, aunts and uncles and cousins and neighbors Eleanor had known for decades. 30 people, maybe more. Someone had brought balloons. Ethan was chasing them around the living room, laughing in the specific, uncontrolled way of 3-year-olds. I arrived exactly at noon. I had not slept well. Madison was already there, talking to my Aunt Carol near the fireplace. She was wearing a green dress, and she looked genuinely happy, which made something in me simultaneously soften and sharpen. I didn't know yet what she knew. I didn't know whether she was complicit in what my mother had arranged or whether she was as much a subject of it as I was. My mother was in the kitchen with 2 of the neighbors, arranging serving dishes with the focused competence she brought to all domestic production. She saw me come in and smiled, the warm public smile she reserved for family events. "Arya, finally," she said. "Come say hello to Eleanor." Eleanor was in the sitting room, in the chair nearest the window, wearing her good blue cardigan. She was a small woman who had never seemed small to me. Something in her posture, in the deliberateness of her attention, made her feel larger than her physical presence. She held a cup of tea and she looked up when I came in with an expression I'd seen on her face before, steady, purposeful, the expression of someone who has been waiting for the right moment. "Arya," she said, and took my hand when I bent to kiss her cheek. Her grip was firm. "You look tired." "I'm fine," I said. "You're not." She said it without judgment. "But you will be." I sat with her for a few minutes, just the 2 of us, while the party arranged itself around us. She asked me about work, about my apartment, about a client project I'd mentioned to her weeks ago. Normal questions. But her eyes were watchful in a way that was different from her usual warmth. She was paying close attention to something I couldn't quite identify. "Is everything all right, Grandma?" I asked. "Everything is exactly as it should be," she said. Then, quietly, "I need you to trust me today." Before I could ask what that meant, Patricia appeared in the doorway and said it was time to start the lunch. We moved into the dining room, all 30-odd of us, finding seats around the extended table and the card tables set up in the adjacent space. My mother sat near the head. Madison sat across from me. Eleanor sat at the center, as she always did at family gatherings, because that was simply where she belonged. The meal was good. The conversation was loud and overlapping and occasionally funny. Ethan fell asleep in Derek's lap before the main course was cleared. I ate and smiled and participated and watched my mother, who was charming and gracious and occasionally glanced at me with that slightly monitoring look she had, checking to make sure I was behaving as expected. Just before dessert, Eleanor stood up. She didn't do it dramatically. She simply stood, and the room quieted the way rooms quiet for people who have earned attention over decades rather than demanded it. "I want to say a few things," she said. "Because I'm 70 years old and I've earned the right to say them directly." She began with the expected things: gratitude for the family gathered, warmth for the people in the room, a few gentle jokes about what 70 actually felt like. People laughed. My mother was smiling. Then Eleanor reached under her chair and produced a manila envelope. I had not seen her bring it into the room. I didn't know it was there. She set it on the table in front of her with the calm precision of someone who had been planning this moment for some time. "Some of you know," she said, "that I gave my granddaughter Arya a car for her birthday in August. A Mercedes GLC. I paid for it in full, and I have the documentation here." The room went very quiet. "I funded this car because Arya needed reliable transportation for her work, and I wanted her to have it." She paused. Her voice was steady, warm but absolutely unmoving. What I have learned in the past few weeks is that this car, which belongs to Arya, has been taken and given to another family member without Arya's knowledge or consent. And that a story has been circulated among some of you that Arya generously volunteered the car. I want to be clear, she did not. My mother's expression had changed. The change was subtle, she was too controlled for a dramatic reaction, but I saw it. The smile didn't disappear so much as it recalculated, rearranged itself around a new situation. I also want you to know, Eleanor continued, that when I purchased this car, I had Linda sign a written agreement confirming that the vehicle was bought exclusively for Arya and that neither parent had authority over its use or transfer. She opened the envelope and removed several pages, which she passed to my uncle Robert on her right. Robert has reviewed these documents. He can confirm what they say. Robert, my father's brother, a quiet man with a background in property law, took the pages and looked at them for a moment. He nodded once. "The documents are clear," he said. "The car was purchased for Arya's exclusive use." Linda signed the acknowledgement. Every head in the room turned, by degrees, toward my mother. The silence in the dining room had a specific texture. Not the silence of shock exactly, more the silence of people recalibrating what they thought they knew. My mother set down her fork. She didn't rush. She smoothed the napkin in her lap. She looked at Eleanor with an expression I recognized, the composed, slightly pained expression she used when she felt she was being misunderstood by someone whose opinion she cared about. "Mom," she said, addressing Eleanor, her mother, with a gentleness that was calibrated and deliberate. "I think this is a mischaracterization of what happened. I didn't take anything. Madison needed the car temporarily, and I thought." "Linda." Eleanor's voice was quiet and final. Not raised. Not harsh. Just completely immovable. "I signed a document. You signed the same document. We both know what it says." My mother's jaw tightened slightly. "Arya works from home. She wasn't using it." "That's not the point," Eleanor said. "And you know that." I had been sitting very still. My hands were flat on the table. I was aware of every person in the room in the way you're aware of things when your nervous system is working very hard to keep your face neutral. Madison was across from me, and when I glanced at her, what I saw was not defiance. It was something closer to mortification. She was looking at her plate. My mother shifted her strategy. She turned slightly toward the room, not dramatically, but I caught it. She was doing what she did best, which was to address the audience rather than the subject. "This was a family matter," she said, with a note of wounded dignity. "A practical decision made in the interest of everyone. Madison had a child to transport and an unreliable vehicle. Arya was flexible. I don't think this needs to be." "Mom." My voice came out steadier than I expected. The whole room turned toward me. "You told people I offered the car." "I didn't offer it. I didn't know you'd taken it until I found Ethan's car seat inside." The room absorbed that. My mother looked at me. And for a moment, just a moment, I saw something move behind her eyes that wasn't calculation. Something older and more complicated. But then it was gone. "You would have said no," she said. Quietly. As if that explained it. As if that justified it. "Yes," I said. "I would have. It's my car." The table held 30 people and they were all very still. "She needed it more," my mother said. And here was the thing about Linda Reynolds, she believed it. I could see it in the way she said it. She wasn't lying about the logic. She had built an entire internal architecture in which this made complete sense, in which taking something from me and giving it to Madison was not theft, but reallocation. Not betrayal, but practical management of family resources. The cruelty of it was that she didn't experience it as cruel. She experienced it as reasonable. That was the part that took my breath away, quietly, in the middle of a room full of people. Not the taking of the car. Not even the lie about my consent. It was the absolute, untroubled certainty that she'd done the right thing. Derek spoke then, carefully, the way he always did, measured, diplomatic, not wanting to escalate. "I want to say that I didn't know about any agreement," he said. "I thought it was arranged between the family. I wouldn't have been comfortable otherwise." Madison looked up from her plate. Her eyes were red. "I didn't know either," she said. Her voice was thin. "Mom, you told me Arya offered. You said she suggested it." The room shifted. My mother looked at Madison, and the expression on her face was the most unguarded I had ever seen it. Not guilt exactly, but something that briefly didn't know what shape to take. "I was handling it," she said quietly. "I was making it work for everyone." "You weren't handling it," Eleanor said. "You were deciding for everyone. Including Arya. Including me." She looked at my mother steadily. "I didn't buy that car for you to manage, Linda. I bought it for Arya." The 8 words came later, when the initial confrontation had settled into something lower and more complicated. When my Aunt Carol had quietly taken Ethan into the other room and Derek had stepped back from the table and the remaining people were sitting with the weight of what had just happened. Eleanor looked at my mother one last time and said, simply and without anger, "The car goes back to Arya today." 8 words. Not a question. Not a request. My mother looked at her own mother, and something in her face went through several stages I won't try to name. Finally, she reached into her pocket and set a set of keys on the table. Mercedes keys. My keys. I picked them up. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Patricia said something quiet to the person beside her, and the room began, very slowly, to breathe again. I sat with the keys in my hand, and I felt something I hadn't expected, not triumph, not vindication. Something quieter. Something that felt like the moment after a very long-held breath is finally released. Later, when most people had drifted into the sitting room and the kitchen, Madison found me on the covered porch. She came out quietly and stood beside me at the railing, looking at the November garden going bare and gray. "I'm sorry," she said. Not with performance. Just the 2 words, plain. "I know," I said. "I genuinely didn't know she hadn't asked you." She wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. "I would never have Arya, you know that." I didn't know it, actually. That was one of the things I'd been working out all week. Madison hadn't engineered this. She'd been a recipient. She'd accepted something that was offered without asking questions she should have asked, which was its own kind of blindness, but it wasn't malice. "I know," I said again. She was quiet for a moment. "What happens now?" "I take my car home," I said. "And we figure out the rest later." She nodded. Derek came to the door then and said it was time to get Ethan home, and Madison touched my arm briefly before she went inside, just a touch, warm and a little uncertain, the gesture of someone beginning a longer conversation she didn't yet know how to have. I stayed on the porch for a few more minutes. The garden was very still. Somewhere inside, I could hear Eleanor's voice, the particular cadence of her telling a story, and the sound of people laughing at something she'd said. My father found me before I left. Richard Reynolds was not a man who spoke often or at length. He processed the world in a kind of watchful quiet that I had always found both familiar and frustrating. He put a hand briefly on my shoulder and said, "I should have said something sooner." That was all. But from my father, it was significant. He knew it. I knew it. I drove home in the Mercedes that evening. My own car. The seat adjusted to my height, the mirrors set to my angles, the playlist I'd saved still queued from the last time I'd driven it 3 months ago. It shouldn't have felt like as much as it did. It was a car. But sitting in it, pulling out of Eleanor's driveway, I felt something settle into place that had been misaligned for longer than 6 weeks. For years, maybe. The specific sensation of something being returned that had never actually been given away. The weeks after Eleanor's birthday party were quieter than I expected. I had prepared myself for an escalation, for calls, for family group messages, for my mother's particular way of managing the aftermath of situations that hadn't gone the way she'd planned. What I got instead was a silence that lasted 10 days. My mother didn't call. She didn't text. I knew from Patricia that she was processing, which in Linda Reynolds' vocabulary meant working out how to reframe events into a narrative she could live with. The call came on a Thursday evening. I was at my desk, finishing an article, the Mercedes parked outside my building where I could see it from the window when I looked up. A small thing, but I noticed it every time. My mother's voice on the phone was controlled in a way that cost her something. I could hear it, the careful management of a woman who is not accustomed to being publicly wrong. "I want you to know," she said, "that I was trying to do what was best for the family." I waited. "I may have handled it incorrectly," she continued. The word "may" was doing considerable work in that sentence. But my intention was never to hurt you. I know your intention wasn't to hurt me, I said. That's not really the point. She was quiet for a moment. What is the point? The point is that you made a decision about something that belonged to me without asking me. And then you told people I'd agreed to it. Those are two separate things, and both of them were wrong. Another silence. I didn't fill it. You've always been so independent, she said eventually, and the strange thing was that I think she meant it as a compliment, or at least as an explanation. As if my independence had created a vacancy she'd felt authorized to manage. Being independent doesn't mean my things are available, I said. It means I handle my own life. Those are different. She didn't have an answer to that. We talked for a few more minutes, cautiously, carefully, neither of us saying the largest things that were true. She didn't apologize directly. She came close, circled it, and then moved on to asking about my work, which was her way of signaling that she was ready to exit the difficult part of the conversation. I let her. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It wasn't closure. It was more like the beginning of a different kind of relationship, one in which I no longer operated under the assumption that my mother's judgment about what I needed was more reliable than my own. Grandma Eleanor called the day after that. She told me, with characteristic calm, that she had restructured the terms of a family trust she managed, moving the administration to Robert and Patricia, removing my parents as signatories. She did not present this as punishment. She presented it as a practical adjustment based on a demonstrated pattern. I love your mother, she said. But love doesn't require me to give her authority over things that aren't hers. I wrote that down. I kept it. The relationship with Madison was its own separate process. She texted me the week after the party with something longer and more careful than her usual messages, a real accounting of what she'd accepted without questioning, what she should have asked, what she understood now about the way our family worked and the position I'd been quietly placed in for most of our lives. It wasn't a perfect message. Some of it was still oriented toward her own discomfort rather than mine. But it was genuine, and I recognized the effort it represented. We had coffee the following Saturday. It was slightly awkward in the way that honest conversations between people who have been operating at a comfortable distance often are. We talked about the car and about our mother, and eventually about the years before that, the accumulated pattern of how things had always been distributed between us, which neither of us had ever named directly. I didn't know how much you were adjusting, Madison said. She was holding her cup with both hands, looking at the table. I just thought you were easygoing. I thought so too, I said. For a long time. She looked up at that. I think I confused being accommodating with being good, I said. I thought if I didn't make demands, I was being generous. I didn't understand that there's a version of that which is just making yourself easy to overlook. Madison was quiet for a moment. I should have asked, she said. About the car. Even if Mom said it was fine. I should have called you directly. Yes, I said. You should have. She nodded. There was something in her face that was working through something real, not just guilt, but a more uncomfortable kind of recognition. I didn't push it. Some things need to be arrived at in their own time. We hugged when we left, which was not something we did often. It felt tentative and a little formal. But it felt real. I drove home along a route that took me past Eleanor's house. I didn't stop, she didn't know I was coming and she was probably resting, but I slowed as I passed. The Craftsman house sat quiet in the late autumn light, the garden bare, the covered porch empty. The house where the truth had been laid out in a manila envelope on a birthday dinner table by a 70-year-old woman who had quietly prepared for exactly this moment. I thought about what it must have taken her. To watch. To wait. To plan carefully enough that when the moment came, it was complete, documented, witnessed, irrefutable. Eleanor had seen the pattern long before I articulated it, and she had chosen the moment and the method with the precision of someone who understood that some things cannot be halfway fixed. 8 words. The car goes back to Arya today. The thing about those 8 words is that they weren't really about the car. The car was the object. The 8 words were about something larger. About the fact that my grandmother had looked at a pattern of quiet, comfortable erasure and decided that it would stop on her birthday, in her house, in front of everyone who had the most influence over how the family understood itself. She had given me more than a Mercedes. She had given me a witness. In the months that followed, I rebuilt things quietly. My freelance work expanded, 2 new long-term clients, a small retainer from a startup that needed regular content, enough that I started thinking seriously about whether I could move to a bigger apartment in a year or two. I drove to client meetings in my own car. I set boundaries with my mother that I'd never bothered to set before, not dramatically, not with speeches, but with the simple, repeated practice of saying no when I meant no and not waiting to see if silence would smooth things over. My mother and I found a kind of equilibrium. Not the one we'd had before, that had been built on my willingness to disappear when convenient, and I wasn't going back to it. The new one was more honest and less comfortable and probably better for both of us. She called me more than she used to. I picked up more than I used to. Something had shifted in the architecture of how she saw me, and I suspected Eleanor's birthday had something to do with it. I didn't stop being someone who could be generous. But I learned to tell the difference between generosity and habit. Between giving something freely and having it taken from you while you smiled and told yourself it was fine. That distinction, once you've learned to feel it, becomes very difficult to unfeel. The last Sunday of November, I drove to Eleanor's house for tea. Just the two of us, the way we sometimes did. She made the good tea, the kind she kept in the tin with the blue lid, and we sat in the sitting room with the afternoon light coming through the window, and she asked me about my work, and I told her about the new clients, and she listened with the full, focused attention she brought to everything. At some point she said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," I said, and meant it. She nodded, satisfied, and picked up her cup. Outside, through the window, the November garden was gray and still, and the light was already starting to go. "Good," she said. "I thought you would be." Linda Reynolds never thought of herself as someone who took things from her daughter. That's what makes her the most uncomfortable kind of antagonist, not the kind who knows what they're doing and does it anyway, but the kind who has built such a complete internal justification for their behavior that the wrongdoing never registers as wrongdoing at all. When she told people Arya had generously offered the car, she wasn't lying in the way that requires conscious effort. She was translating a decision she'd already made into a language the world would accept. The lie was almost secondary. The primary act was the decision itself, the quiet, confident assumption that she had the authority to redistribute what belonged to her younger daughter. What this story ultimately traces is the long-term cost of chronic favoritism on the person who isn't favored. Not the dramatic cost, not the visible damage, but the slow, invisible erosion of someone's expectation that their needs will be considered at all. Arya had spent 24 years learning to need less, ask less, adjust more. She had done it so consistently and so skillfully that she had mistaken it for her own personality. She thought she was easygoing. She didn't recognize that she had been trained into it. The car was only ever a symbol. What was actually being contested in that dining room was the question of whether Arya's ownership of anything, her property, her decisions, her space in the family, required justification. Linda's implicit answer, revealed in every dismissal and redirection, had always been yes. Eleanor's answer, laid out in 8 words and a manila envelope, was categorically no. What's worth examining is the role Madison played, not as a villain, but as an enabler who didn't know she was enabling. She accepted what was offered because it was convenient, and because she trusted that the arrangement had been made properly. That trust wasn't unreasonable in isolation. But it rested on a foundation she'd never thought to examine, the assumption that in her family, Arya's needs were always already accounted for in some prior calculation. Madison had benefited from that assumption her whole life without ever naming it. The birthday party forced her to name it. There's something worth sitting with in the way this resolution came from outside, from Eleanor, from documents, from a grandmother who had watched long enough to understand exactly what was needed and how to deliver it. Arya didn't save herself in the traditional sense. She was witnessed, and that witnessing changed the room. That's not a weakness in the story. It's actually one of the most honest things about it. Not every person who has been made invisible can make themselves visible alone. Sometimes what it takes is someone who already has authority in the space choosing to use it differently. What Arya learned was not simply to stand up for herself. It was something quieter and more durable. That silence is not neutral. That accommodation, when it becomes automatic, stops being a choice. and that the person who never asks for anything will eventually find that nobody thinks to ask them either. The car is parked outside her building now. She can see it from her desk. A small, concrete fact about what is hers and what it means, finally, to know the difference. What stays with me most in this story isn't the confrontation. It's everything that came before it, all the Sundays, all the silences, all the small moments where Arya adjusted herself and called it kindness. That's the part that feels most real to me. Most of us have done some version of that. Made ourselves smaller in a relationship, accepted an arrangement that wasn't fair, told ourselves it was temporary or generous or not worth the conflict. And sometimes it genuinely is those things. But sometimes, and this is what Arya had to learn the hard way, we've simply trained the people around us to believe that our silence means yes. That our patience means unlimited. That our easygoing nature means we don't have needs of our own. The question worth carrying out of this story isn't just what would you do if someone took your car? It's the quieter one underneath it. What have you already agreed to without ever saying a word?